Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
You know, I've been around 18 years speaking at conferences, roundups, and retreats, either as a speaker or as a moderator. And most of the time, the committees give me a person to host me that look like Jewel. Finally, the gods are smiling down at me. You met my wife, Nancy. She's my American Express card. I rarely leave home without her. It's good to be around here and talk to all you people about what you've been going through about the last 5 or 6 years. And Nancy said it. We've seen for ourselves some of the devastation that went on over here. It doesn't show on television like we witnessed today with our eyes. And I just want to tell you personally, I found something in the big book that I think fits all you committee members, and I'm going to read it before I really start my program, okay? It said, "We are people who normally would not mix, but there exists among us a fellowship, a friendliness, and an understanding which is indescribably wonderful. We are like the passengers of a great liner the moment after rescue from shipwreck, where camaraderie, joyousness, and democracy pervade the vessel from steerage to the captain table. Unlike the feeling of the ship passengers, however, our joy in escape from the disaster does not subside as we go our individual ways. Salute." Okay, I have to look at her. I'm an alcoholic. My name is DIZ Titcher. My sobriety date is Cinco de Mayo, 1981. My home group's a mustard seed group in Tallahassee, Florida. It's one of the best 2 groups in the world. And my sponsor's Tommy Hicks from Crawfordville, Florida, and Tommy has a sponsor. I also want to point out it's good to be around with Lyle again. A couple years ago, we got together and we were able to share some very intimate, personal moments in this fellowship. And we got to relive them yesterday a little bit when we was talking. And that's what this whole thing is all about. You know, the things that we share with one another and the way we get along with people. I want to thank Charles and his committee for inviting me here to participate in this roundup. And I'd like to thank Jack Daniels and Jim Beam for making it possible for me to be here. You know, I never drank when I was 3 years old, but I always felt like I could have used one. And I waited 5 more years until I had my first drink of alcoholic beverage, and it was given to me by my father. On the weekends, he loved to sit on the front porch. And sometimes his friends would come by, and when they would get enough friends, what he would do, he would go in the house and get an old oyster can and bring it out to me and send me across the street to the beer garden and fill it up with draft beer. And if I could bring it back across that street without spilling any, then I got to take a sip. And from that moment, I felt that sense and ease that comes to all of us when we take that first drink. All right? Also, my first resentment I ever had, I got towards my father. One day he told me he wanted me to cut the neighbor's yard. And she was a widow lady, and she had the largest yard in the neighborhood. Now, let me tell you something. We didn't have power motors in my day. We had those old push clickety-click mowers, and it was a big effort for a 12-year-old to cut that grass. And the other thing he told me, he said, I don't want you to accept any money from Mrs. Robinson. And I got another resentment. And you know, I missed out on one of the greatest lessons in life that was taught to me when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous: to help other people and don't expect anything in return. I used to steal beer from beer trucks. I got pretty good at it. I could fill up my 4 pockets real quick with bottles and take off before the driver could ever find out he was missing anything. And I'd always take that and share with my buddies, you know. So we'd always drink together a lot of times. So I got to stealing. And the other thing, when I went to school, I always got real friendly with some of the smart ladies that were in my class, because sometimes if I didn't study, they would help me get through some of the tests. I can remember one time I wasn't prepared for a test, and Patty, the girl that was sitting next to me, filled out all the answers and handed me her paper. And I handed her my paper, and I signed my name at the top of it and turned it in. And 2 days later, the teacher said, "Diz," he says, "do you know that your paper had exactly the same answers as Patty's did?" And I said, "Well, we studied together." You know, I started trying to get lies to come out to make me look better. So I did that, and I was born during the Depression. My father provided for us as well as he possibly could during that time. And the Depression I was born in, I thought, is worse than the one we're in now. And I never got a new pair of clothes until I was 17 or 18 years old. And a lot of times I'd have to wear my brother's clothes, and as I would, you know, the pants would gather in the back, and you know how you kind of pull them all around so you look good. And I was always trying to avoid somebody seeing me, because I didn't want them to think that, you know, I couldn't afford new clothes, or I was poorer than what the rest of them were. I heard a lot of old beliefs when I was young like that I'm not good enough and I can't do that. That stayed with me up through the ages until I got in Alcoholics Anonymous. I played sports in school because that's where acceptance and applause was. You know, I didn't have to do anything. If I excelled at something, then I got patted on the back and I got applause. I turned out to be a pretty good athlete. Any athlete with the name of DIZ has got to be probably a baseball player, wouldn't you think? I was a baseball pitcher. I could throw the hard high one, and I got the nickname of Dizzy Dean. And later on, they just dropped the Dean, and later on, they dropped the ZY. And I went all through almost high school and college, but instructors called me Diz. I played basketball in high school, and I was pretty good. I made the all-conference team, and I better tell you where I'm really from. I'm from Charleston, West Virginia. And so I got 3 scholarships. And believe it or not, one of the scholarships right up here to Hattiesburg, Mississippi, southern Mississippi. And a West Virginia boy from South Charleston, West Virginia, was the basketball coach up there. And so that's the way I got my connection to come down to Hattiesburg. But let me tell you, being born in West Virginia with those beautiful green mountains and that fresh air, when I came to Hattiesburg, they didn't have that. And I got terrible lonesome. I got homesick. And I called my dad and I said, I want to come home. And he said, you can come home. And when I got home, he told me, he said, you're going to go to work in the plant. And I had an older brother and an older sister too, but my brother said, no, he's going to go to school, Dad. And he took me down to the local school where I had a scholarship there too, and he enrolled me in college. And so I was attending classes there until one day when I was coming out to get in my car to go to work, I passed a basketball coach. And he said, "Hey, what are you doing here?" I said, "I'm going to school." And he said, "I thought you went down to Mississippi." I said, "I did, but I came back." And he said, "Well, come in the office tomorrow. I want to talk to you." And so I said, "Okay." So I went in the office the next day, and when he took me in, he sat me down. He said, he said, "I don't have a scholarship available for you at all. But he said, I like the way you play your basketball. And he said, if you'll come out for the team, and if you make it, I'll put you on scholarship." And I said, "Okay." And I went home and talked it over with my dad. And he said, "You've always wanted to play basketball." And he said, "You go ahead and do that. And your mom and I will support you in it." And so I did. I went out for the team. And I was freshman, and I made the traveling squad as the 12th member my freshman year. And he put me on scholarship when it came to about January. And I loved college life. And no sooner I was going to college, but they had fraternities there, and they had rush parties. And I was rushed by 2 different fraternities. And, of course, they just have beer parties going all the way. And believe it or not, I could drink pretty good. I didn't know I could, but I could hold my own pretty good. And finally, the fraternity I selected was called the Phi Sigs. And I didn't know it at the time, but the Phi Sigs had been reprimanded for disorderly conduct and rowdy behavior and public intoxication 7 times in the previous 3 years. And I said to myself, my kind of people. And so I became a part of that fraternity. And then later on in November, the college that I went to celebrated a special day. It was based on a comic strip by Little Abner, or Little Abner Daisy May. And if you all remember that comic strip at all, you remember that they were living in Dog Patch. And in Dog Patch, the mayor was a guy by the name of Abner Hawkins. And Abner Hawkins had a daughter that he wanted to get married off. And she wasn't the best looking kid in the block. So he came up with this plan to get all the single guys and start them on a starting line with a shotgun start. And then 15 minutes later, all the single women was given a shotgun start, and the single women caught the single men and got them back to the starting line before sundown. They had to get married. So that was the whole premise of it. But those of you remember the comic strip, and the next hollow over was called Skunk Holler. And Skunk Holler was the home of the Skag Boys. And the Skag Boys were notorious for making Kickapoo joy juice. You wouldn't be surprised if they selected my fraternity to be the Skag Boys, would you? Well, they did. And we lived up to our past behavior. They set up Dog Patch over here and had all the town and the festivities were going to go on here. So around the corner here, we set up Skunk Holler. And we got 2 wash tubs, filled them up with ice, filled them up with grain alcohol. We put grape juice in one, we put lime juice in the other one. We called one Purple Jesus, and we called the other one Green Goddammit. And if you went by and took 2 cups of either one of those drinks in those wash tubs, you started paying back things you never, ever borrowed. We lived up to our reputation all right, because after the festivities over and Daisy May and Little Abner and all these other people got married, they had a square dance. Now, let me tell you what, you ought to seen the Skag Boys square dance and shooting off rifles, do-sa-doing and swinging your partner. I mean, we had a ball. About 3 days later, we go back to school, 3 days later after that, we got another reprimand from the president of the school for our rowdy behavior and public intoxication. So, it just seemed to follow me around. I was drafted in the Army, and after I took my induction, they sent me to Fort Knox, Kentucky, 31 miles from Louisville. Louisville has 9 distilleries around the city. And on Saturday morning, they give a tour of their facilities between 9 and 1. And they give out free samples. If you had a good car and you timed yourself right, you could make 3 of those distilleries before they closed up. Normal drinkers don't do things like that, do they? Well, I did that for, probably about once a month. I had about 2 or 3 buddies, and that's what we did. After I got discharged from the Army, I went back home. And instead of going, I had a few hours I had to finish in order to graduate, so instead of going back full-time, I went back at nighttime. But I kept up my fraternity membership, and so it came up, there's a big football game coming up, and there was going to be a parade with the float, and so I said, I'll help you decorate the float. So every night I would take a 6-pack down and sit there and help decorate the float and everything. For after about a week, taking a 6-pack and doing that and everything, finally they had a dress rehearsal. I didn't know it, but they brought in these 2 girls from the school, and they were going to be on the float. And so I looked at one of them. She looked very nice and interesting, and I said, I wonder if we'd go out on a date. And she said, well, okay. And so we started dating, and we got along pretty good. Hit things pretty good. And later on, we got married. And I thought, boy, this thing is going to be pretty good. I started working at the plant, and I was doing all right. And we bought a little house, bought it on my GI Bill. And we just had this little place out there. It's going to, it's just going to be just like you want. A little white house with a picket fence, and you just live life good. And everything went real well. When I'd come home, we'd usually sit down at the kitchen table, maybe drink a beer and converse about what went on during the day. And that went on for a long time. And then she got pregnant, and my daughter Kimberly was born. Well, that kind of interrupted what happened when I came home, and put things off for a while. And I'd sit and drink by myself a couple beers or something like that, and she'd take care of the kids, and then we'd have dinner, and then we just couldn't get back in that sync. And then after a couple of years, she got pregnant again, and there again, the time I had to spend with her and talk with her and everything got shorter and shorter and shorter. And so finally, one night after work, the boy said, why don't you come over to Andy's and have a beer with us? I said, okay, I'll do that. And so I went over to Andy's and had a couple of beers, and when I got home, she didn't even know what time I got in the door. It was just, she was concentrating on the kids and taking care of that and feeding them when they had to be fed, and whenever I could eat, I could eat. And believe it or not, we had a 3rd child, Dana, and then it just got completely worse for her time. And this is my perception too, by the way. And slow but surely, I was going to the bars with the guys. Weekends, I'd go out with them. Some nights, I'd stay out late. I started doing all those crazy things you hear alcoholics doing. I was chasing women, I was drinking excessively. And sooner or later, she just got tired of that that kind of relationship. And she divorced me. And when I went to the divorce hearing, and they went through all that legal stuff they went through, I sit there and I didn't have any feeling about that whatsoever. Not one piece of feeling. And when it was all over, I just got up and said, okay. And I went on with my life. And I got different kinds of jobs that took me around the state of West Virginia and working at different things. But one of the best I had was got a job with a discount department store. And after about 2.5 years, I worked my way up the ladder, and I got a manager of a store in Morgantown, West Virginia. And that's the home of West Virginia University. And I loved to watch football, and I loved to watch basketball, and the company I worked for had season tickets. And so I told all my friends, I said, boy, you can come out now, and we can tailgate, and we just can have a hell of a party. And so that's what we did. We'd tailgate, but when we'd go to the game, you couldn't take anything in the drink because they had these state policemen on the gates. And they would search you if you looked suspicious. And they'd go through your pocketbooks, big coats, everything. And I kind of said to myself, that's not nice, you know? And so as every good alcoholic can do, I said, I know what I'm going to do. And I went and I bought a pair of 7 by 35 binoculars. And I took the tops off of them and took them apart and cleaned all the insides of them, you know? And I coated the inside of them real good. I could put 6 ounces of booze in this one and 6 ounces of booze in this one, put the cap on it, put that strap over it, and I walked right in that gate. Normal people don't do things like that, do they? No. The other thing, when I was manager of that store, one of the things they like for us to do is go out and meet the other businesses in the community. And I did. There was a Lowe's store, and I went and met that manager. A Kroger store, a food store, and I went to meet him. A shoe store, a nice service station where I dealt with, and I met them guys. But right next door was a Ford garage. And I went over and introduced myself to the owner of it, and then he introduced me to his sales manager. His name was Hack. And then he got busy and went off, and I was talking to Hack there, and Hack says, do you golf? I said, sure, I like to golf. He said, well, I golf every Thursday. If you want to come with us, that'd be fine. So I went over and talked to my assistant manager and said, listen, I got to have Thursday afternoon off. They said, okay. So I called him, and I said, hey, I got Thursday afternoon off. He said, fine, you drive. I said, oh, all right. So I drove and picked him up and was going down the road to this country club where he lived on 24.5 miles. And as soon as we get through the red light, he says, pull over. And so I pull over in this 7-Eleven. He goes in and gets a 6-pack. And he comes out with that 6-pack, and he pops one, gives me one. He pops it, and he takes the other one. Well, 24.6 miles, and I got to drive. I only had 2, and he had 4. But then we pulled into the country club and pulled up to his house. He lived right beside a number 9 green. And down there they had their own golf carts. And he pulls his golf cart out of the garage, and I stuck on the back of it. That's this great big white cylinder on the back of it. I said, what's that? He said, that's a bazooka. I said, what's that for? He said, I'll show you. He took it off the golf cart and took it in the house, took the cap off of it, and started pushing beers down in it. You know, you could get about 8 cans of beer down in there, put the cap back on. And so we'd go play golf. Now, we went down to the first tee, and we met 2 other guys down there named Billy and Red, and they had a bazooka on the back of their golf cart, too. I said, this is going to be something else. So we're playing golf, drinking a beer. Playing golf, drinking a beer. Finally, everything in that bazooka's gone. And I didn't know what was going on, but Hack on number 8, he pulls behind this house with this golf cart, and there's this screen porch. He takes that bazooka, goes in this house, opens the refrigerator on there, fills them back up. Red and Billy come, they fill theirs up. They got this thing going on that's just wild and crazy. And so all of a sudden, we're playing and drinking and playing and drinking. We get around to number 14, and all of a sudden, Hack takes the golf cart and goes out and goes underneath this big hedge. And when we get underneath that hedge, there's the prettiest log cabin you've ever seen before in your life. I said, wow, there's a stream that's coming down from the mountain, and this guy's got a pool. He made a pool for that mountain stream. And I said, man, this is my kind of living. And that's where Red lived. So Red and Billy comes in. Now we have to take our shoes off because we're going to go in the little house here and we're going to have what they call shooters. They got these tall glasses about like this. They fill them up with ice. They put gin or vodka in them and put some kind of fruit juice in them. And then we go outside and sit in that sun and started drinking these shooters. Well, we drank so many of those shooters, it got dark. And I'm thinking to myself, how are we going to get back up to Hack's house? Well, what they did, we got back on the golf carts and we went out on a county road. And we took the county road and went all the way back to Hack's house. And I said, wow, that's some kind of living. But, you know, normal people don't do things like that, do they? I stayed there, and finally they paid my membership to that golf club because I was such a good drinker, and I could have, you know, they enjoyed my company. They even got me a house on the golf course that I leased for $100 a month. And when first time I went in that house, I went to the refrigerator and opened it up. It was filled with beer. I couldn't believe it. I really thought this was some kind of heaven. And so every weekend I was down there, and every Thursday I played golf. I mean, for over 2 years. So one time I saw advertised the club championship. And I said, I think I'll play in that. So I filled out whatever you fill out, sent my check, sent it in. It was supposed to start the next Thursday. So the next Thursday I come down and I get my clubs and golf cart and everything. I don't think Hack played, so I used his golf cart. And so I come down to check and see who I'm going to be playing with and everything else. And the pro, his name was George Belgian. He said, Diz, come here a minute. Come here. I said, George, what do you want? He said, I need to talk to you. And I said, George, I'm trying to play in this championship if you'll let me. He said, Diz, we can't let you play because we can't establish a handicap for you. I said, George, I've been playing golf down here for over 2 years, and you mean to tell me you can't establish a handicap for me? He said, Diz, you never played more than 14 holes. Anyway, I continued to work that job. Finally, I lost it, and I was managed to get one as a traveling salesman, traveling the state of West Virginia. And that's the worst life that an alcoholic could possibly get because there was a lot of drinking that went on, a lot of carrying on going on. I started having demons run around and had a lot of unexpected things happen to me. So I just said, well, I got to do something about this. And I said, well, I got a friend that's a psychologist. His name is McCoy, and I'll give him a call. And I called him up, and I talked to him, and I said, I don't know what's going on, Mac, but I just need to call somebody and let all this out. He said, well, good. Come over Thursday afternoon about 3:30. So I did. I walked in his office about 3:30, sit down. Well, tell me what's going on. For the next 3 hours, I told him everything that was going on in my life, all my feelings and the demons in my head, and just, you know, just really just about ready to really go crazy. And after I finished talking, he just looked and he said, Diz, he said, I don't have anything to tell you at all. And he said, but there's a friend of mine I think can help you. And let me call him, and I'll call you tomorrow and tell you if I can get a hold of him. And so I said, okay. Well, I went out that night and drank and carried on and everything else. And the next day was a Friday, and I didn't do much work except paperwork. And Mac called me, and he said, Diz, I got you an appointment to see Dr. So-and-so at Dunn Hospital. You know where it is? And I said, oh, yeah, I know where it is. And He said, 9 o'clock Saturday morning. And I said, okay. So I went out that night, crazy, drank, got in late, got up, had one of those hangovers, took an Alka-Seltzer, and got in a car and drove down to Dunn Hospital. And I got there kind of early, and I walked in. Nobody was there. I was in the reception room, so I started looking around on the wall. Psychiatric hospital. Huh. Doctor of psychiatry. Psychiatrist. I said, oh, my God. I said, Mac thinks I'm crazy and didn't want to tell me. About that time, a guy came out and said, your name DIZ? And I said, yeah. He said, come on in. So I went to his office, said, sit down there, and said, now tell me what's been going on. So I started telling him what's going on, and I couldn't have been talking 3 minutes. And he said, yeah. He said, I understand exactly what you're going through. So I started telling more and more and more. He says, yeah. He said, I've had several people to have exactly the same thing happen to you. So my talk with him went for about 3 hours, but he kept telling me about certain experiences that was going on in his life, which kind of made me feel better. You know, and after I finished talking, he looked at me and he said, DIZ, he said, I think you're an alcoholic. And I said, oh, hell, I wish I was crazy. And I just started shaking my head, and he said, listen, you don't have to worry too much about it. He says, you can go to AA. And he said, matter of fact, here's a where and when. And he said, this is a real good meeting right here, and this is the one you ought to go to on Monday night. I said, okay. Well, Monday I had to work. And I didn't get back in town about 8:30 that night. And I came in my apartment, put my briefcase down, my keys down, and started to fix me a drink, and the telephone rang. And I went over and picked it up, and a guy said, you weren't at that meeting tonight. I said, hell, you all got a police force. You know, how did they know that? It was that psychiatrist. And I started to give him an excuse. And he said, listen, you don't have to make any excuses with me. He said, just be at that same meeting tomorrow night. There's another meeting there. And I said, okay. Well, Tuesday came, and I really white-knuckled it all day long. I wanted to make sure I got to that meeting, was in decent shape. And I did make that meeting, and I sat on about the third row. It was a speaker's meeting, and all these people got up and started reading all this stuff and saying all these things, and they introduced this guy, and he got up and started talking, and first thing you know, I'm looking at a fly that's flying around, you know, and lighting on people over here or there, and then all of a sudden I'm looking out the window. See, I had no discipline whatsoever, and my attention span was probably about 2.5 minutes long. And after, I guess, about 45 minutes of that end of that talk, I just kind of looked down at the end of the road down there, and when I looked down, I saw that psychiatrist down there. I said, I'll be daggone, he's an alcoholic too. So after the meeting was over and they closed it up and everything, I walked over to him, and he said, DIZ, how you doing? I said, I'm doing good. He said, you don't look it to me. And I said, well, no, I'm not doing too good at all. He said, tell you what I want you to do. So I want you to go to the grocery store, and I want you to pick up a big jar of honey. And said, every time you get that urge to take a drink, I want you to take a big tablespoon of honey. And it'll quiet you down. And I said, okay. And I went to the grocery store and got one, and I practiced that before I even got out of the car. And sure enough, it quieted me down. And I kept going to AA, kept taking that honey, and kept doing it for about a month. I probably got off the honey a little bit. But I kept going, and I kept listening to all you saying. I like speakers meetings, so I finally got built up my attention span to maybe about 25 or 30 minutes. I heard what you said one time about working the steps, and I said, oh, all right. So I got there early one night, and I looked at those steps on the wall, and I worked them all in about 20 minutes. You know, I was in AA for 14 months, and all I ever had was an off-the-wall program. You know, but I loved going to meetings. There was something real special about meetings. And one Monday night, I went to a meeting, speaker's meeting, and a guy gave a nice talk, and after the meeting, I was talking to a couple of my buddies, and all of a sudden, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Turned around and looked, and there was this old man standing there. He said, "Your name DIZ?" And I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "My name's Slick, and I'm your new sponsor." I said, "Who said so?" He turned and he said, "You see those three guys over there?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, we drew straws, and I lost." And I said to myself, my normal way is to go off on you real quick. And I mean, just tell you off and get out, et cetera. But something told me to shut my mouth and to pay attention. And I consider that my first God bump I had in Alcoholics Anonymous. And this old man said to me, "I want you to come over to my house. This is where I live at 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon." And I said, "Okay." And so I looked it up on a map and a phone book and found out where he lived. And so I was over to his house at 2 o'clock. And he greeted me at the front door. And he took me in the kitchen. He had a coffee pot perking on the stove. And he had this beautiful white porcelain table with these heavy white chairs around him. And he had two of these ceramic coffee cups, heavy ones that you used to see in restaurants years ago, and he had them on the table. We sat down and had a cup of coffee, and he started telling me about himself. He started telling me about what his life was like. And I started telling him what my life was like. He started telling me how his work went and everything else, and I started telling him about my work went. He talked about his family. I started talking about my family. And about 2 hours there, we shared with one another, just like it says in the big book. And he said, "That'll be all." And the last thing he asked me, he said, "Do you believe in God?" And I said, "I don't know whether I do or not." He said, "That's all right. That's fine." He said, "Go on home," and said, "Be here next Sunday at 2 o'clock and bring your big book." I said, "Okay." Really and truly, I could hardly wait for the week to go through because I really wanted to get back there and see what was going to happen next. And I said, I came next Sunday, and I drove over to his house. He met me at the front door, took me in the kitchen, had that coffee pot perking on the stove, sit down at that white porcelain table, drink out of them big, heavy cups. And he says, "Open your book up." When I was opening it up, he said, "What do you say?" I said, "Nothing." He said, "Yeah, it's about all you know about alcoholism." I said, "I ain't going to like where this is going." You know, but I said I was going to stick it out, and I'll stick it out. And he just turned to the page, and he explained some things to me, you know. He said, "I want you to pay the second title page. There's a promise under there." And he said, it says, "The story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism." This book tells the story of the first 100 people. I said, "Oh, you know, it's a novel." He said, No. It just tells a story. It's not a novel." And he told me to turn to the preface in the book. He said, "Read the second paragraph to me." And it says, "Because this book has become the basic text for our society and has helped such large number of alcoholic men and women to recover." He said, "This is a textbook." And I said, "Well, I went through school. I know about textbooks." He said, "Well, you know you don't read textbooks, don't you? You study textbooks. You read the paper and you read magazines. That's insignificant information. But this information here needs to be studied." And that's why they call it a textbook. And he said, "Turn the page." I turned the page, the forward to the first edition. He said, "Read me that first couple of sentences there." I said, "We of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body." It didn't say anything about alcohol in there, did it? No. It said, if your problem is alcohol, you could quit tomorrow. They said, that's not your problem. Your problem is alcoholism. You suffer from a disease that won't allow you to stop. Later, I called that isms inside me. That's where all my problems are. The next sentence says to show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. You show people how we recovered. You don't tell anybody how you got sober. That doesn't work. The book says you got to show people. That's why we start off telling our own stories. He then told me, he said, well, we're going to work on step 1, so turn to page 30. And I did. He said, well, read me the second paragraph. It says, we learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholic. This is the first step in recovery. He said, do you understand what that says? And this is where I made my first mistake of answering answering a sponsor's question. You've got to be real careful when they ask you questions. And I said, I think I do. And he said, in AA, you don't think. You either know it or you don't know it. And I said, well, I don't know it. He said, do you understand what fully means? And I said, well, yeah, that means completely. He said, how about concede? Well, I was a history major, and I read about the Civil War, and I remembered Robert E. Lee conceded defeat to General Grant, and I said, yeah, that means surrender. And he said, that's right. And he said, do you know where our innermost self is? There's another one of those questions. And I said, no, not really. He said, well, your innermost self is right here. It involves your heart because that's what makes you go. And this is where you accept everything that's traumatic. You know, every person that you love and you love deeply, you love them with all your heart. You know, it has nothing to do with your mind whatsoever. And I said, wow, okay. He said, you know, the writer of this book is a guy named Bill Wilson. Do you know how he knew that? And I said, no. He said, well, Bill had learned down through his drinking that self-will wouldn't help him whatsoever, that he couldn't quit drinking on self-will. He said he couldn't quit on self-knowledge. He said even at times fear sobered him up a little bit. But if you go back to his story, Bill's story, and you look on page 11, he was visited by his old schoolboy friend, a man named Ebby Thacker. Ebby Thacker had been sober 2 months. He was going to be sentenced to the insane asylum because of his drinking, yet he was rescued by 2 guys. And they belonged to a religious organization called the Oxford Group. And they took Ebby under their wing and took him to New York and got him involved in the Oxford Group, and Ebby was sober. So Ebby made a 12-step call on Bill Wilson. And as he was talking to Bill Wilson didn't believe what he was looking at. And he writes about it. He said, here was something at work in the human heart which had done the impossible. Wow. Now, Bill goes on to write, you turn up to page 55. And Bill says another statement in here, this is the only chapter of any book that you'll find this written in. This tells you who God is and where you can find him. It said, actually, we're fooling ourselves, for deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. It may be obscured by calamity. Calamity is all those problems and all those troubles that we take within ourselves that we don't solve. By pomp, well, you know how we can push things out of the way they really are, make them something better. And the last thing it says, by worship of other things. I worship my drinking, I worship women, I worship money, I worship everything in the whole world. And this is why I wasn't allowing God to work in my life. And he said, what we got to do, we got to clean your act up. And once we clean it up, you'll be able to live a normal life. So he says, I want you to turn to page 52 because we got to look at your unmanageability. And on page 52, it lists the 8 human problems of all alcoholics. The first one is we were having trouble with personal relationships. Anybody here have trouble with personal relationships? How about we couldn't control our emotional nature? Sadness, happy, joyous. They were all out of whack. How about we were a prey to misery and depression? He asked me, you've been miserable in the last 6 months? Cheap shot. You know. And he says, as far as depression, he says, because you're an alcoholic and you drink alcohol, that's scientifically, that's a depressant. And you're going to suffer from it whether you want it or not. I said, Then it said we couldn't make it a living. And Slick said, that don't mean hold down a job. Living encompasses everything you do in life, paying your bills, you know, talking to your kids, going to the grocery store. All those things encompass living, and you're doing a bad job of it. So we had a feeling of uselessness. Yeah, how many times you sit on the couch and just, you know, flip the TV channel doing nothing? How about we were full of fear? I'm glad he put that all the way down there instead of first, because if it had been first, I would have really gone bananas probably. But we are full of fear. I'll talk about that later. He said we were unhappy. Well, I thought I was really happy after I got my divorce, but you know, when I sat down and talked to Slick, I found out what an unhappy person I really was. And then the last thing is we couldn't seem to be a real help to other people. When I was drinking, I didn't want to help anybody else out, you know. It was all about me. You know, what I can do for me, 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 me. Slick said, that's our first step right there. And he said, I want you to turn back to page 45. And I went back to page 45, and he said, now we're going to start on step 2. Lack of power, that was our dilemma. We had to find a power with which we could live. And it had to be a power greater than ourselves. Obviously, the shortest sentence in the big book. But where and how were we to find this power? The next sentence tells us, well, that's exactly what this book is all about. It's to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. It don't say it will help you solve your problem. It says it will solve your problem. And he said, turn the page. He said, I want you to read right in the middle of that. And I said, okay. I said, we found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves, we commenced to get results. Just be willing. Yeah. It says, willing to believe. All through this book, there's a little equation that Bill Wilson pounds into us. And it's, you got to be willing. You got to be willing to believe. You got to believe that you can quit drinking. You got to believe you can have a better life. And once you make a decision based on that belief and take action on that decision, you get results. And from those results, you have faith that your original belief can come true. You know, he put 3 people's names in this chapter that he wanted us to read about. And I'm sure you heard about most of them. On page 51, it talks about a guy named Columbus. And then it talks about a guy named Galileo. Then it talks about 2 people named the Wright brothers. Now listen, I thought those last 2 guys were sniffing glue because they thought they could fly. That's what they believed. Well, they made a decision that if they got the right winds in the right place, they could fly. So they called the Weather Bureau there in Dayton, Ohio, found out that Kitty Hawk, North Carolina had the best winds of all. So they put that apparatus they had on a truck and drove it over to Kitty Hawk. They built this catapult up on this highest dune. And old Wilbur got up in this apparatus, and they cut him loose. They come down that catapult, and he went in the air, and he flew 219 feet. The newspapers wouldn't publish it. Men can't fly. They leave that for the birds. 10 years later, we got planes flying in World War I, all because of the Wright brothers' belief. Now, Galileo was a teacher, a professor at one of the major universities in Italy, and he studied the atmosphere. And in studying, he found out the laws of falling bodies and all this other thing, that the sun is the center of the universe. Well, the church heard about that, and they called him up and said, hey, you're wrong, Galileo. Aristotle and Copernicus tells us that the earth is the center of the universe and everything else revolves around us. And he said, because you don't believe like that, we're putting you under house arrest. They put Galileo under house arrest. But the students that he taught that studied astrology said Galileo is right. And they started teaching Galileo's theory about the sun being the center of the universe. And after some 45 or 50 years, the church said, okay. They let Galileo have house arrest. Now, Columbus, we all read about Columbus. You know, he had a belief that the earth was round. He also believed that you could get east by going west. And there's a pretty good chance that he must be the first alcoholic in record. Now listen to this. When he left Spain, he didn't know where he was going. And when he got there, he didn't know where he was. And when he came back, he couldn't tell anybody where he'd been. And he did it all on somebody else's money. So step 2, to me, is on page 53. It said, when we became alcoholics, crushed by a self-imposed crisis we could not postpone or evade, the disease is going to get us one way or another. We can't hide from it or anything else. It tells me we had to fearlessly face the proposition that either God is everything or else he is nothing. God either is or he isn't. What was our choice to be? Slick said, you can't make that choice in 15 seconds and go on to step 3, because if you do, you're going there with self-will. He says you have to sit down almost every minute of every day and fearlessly face this proposition and make up your mind, make this choice. And when you can make that choice, then you can move on to step 3. So it took me about 2 weeks, and I finally told him I could move on to step 3. He said, fine, turn to page 60. So at the bottom or near the bottom of the page, it says, being convinced. Being convinced. I said, Slick, what are we convinced of? And he said, DIZ, we're convinced of the ABCs. The ABCs are really step 1 and step 2. So if we're convinced of step 1 and step 2, we were at step 3, which is that we decided to turn our will and our life over to God as we understand him. It don't say over to the care of God, not in the book. It says over to God directly. And Slick says, you know what your will is? There's another one of those questions. And I said, not exactly. He said, your will is the way you think. And he says, your life is the action you take on your thinking. So bad thinking takes bad action, gives you bad results. So what we want you to do, we want you to do 2 things. It says, 2 questions after this says, just what do we mean by that and just what do we do? Well, let's take the first one. Just what do we mean by that? Well, the next paragraph says, any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. Further down it says, each person is like an actor who wants to run the whole show. You know why Bill Wilson put the word actor in there? He didn't know your name. So when you read the rest of these 2 pages, 2.5 pages, and you see the word he, his, him in there, if you'd substitute your name, you'll find out exactly what your problem is. For the next 3 pages, it talks about self, or a variation of the word self, 24 times. Does that get your attention? The second question said, just what do we do? When you turn the page on 62, at the bottom it says, first of all, we had to quit playing God. That's what we do. We quit playing God. It doesn't work. Then look at this. Next, we decided, there's our decision. We decided that hereafter in this drama life, God was going to be our director. He's the principal and we are his agents. He's the father and we are his children. That's your third step decision. And that's the decision I had to make. I didn't have any great belief in God, but I did believe in a power greater than myself, and that's what I believed in. And you know, the next page it talks about some promises that are going to come true, and most of them came true immediately. And then one of the first prayers in the big book that everybody to my knowledge loves, and it was written by Bill Wilson, who's the #1 drunk. You know, it said, God, I offer myself to thee to build with me and do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help with thy power, thy love, and thy way I die. May I do thy will always. That's a beautiful prayer, but there's a hook in there. And the hook is, relieve me of the bondage of self. We've been talking about self 24 times in 3.5 pages. That's what we need to get rid of. The way I'm driving this vehicle is not doing too good at all. Somebody else can do a better job. And so that's what I need to do. So Slick said, we're going to work the twin steps. I said, what? He said, we're going to work the twin steps. In one step, you prepare, and the next one, you execute. You prepare and you execute. 4 and 5, 6 and 7, 8 and 9. So the next action steps, we're going to try to help you get well. And the thing that I like about Bill Wilson is that he compares a personal inventory to a business inventory. And I knew about business inventory because when I went out that worked for that discount store, I had to inventory everything in that store every January 1st. So I knew about those things. And it says we got to take a commercial inventory as a fact-finding, that's searching, and a fact-facing, that's fearless, process. That's our inventory. One object is to disclose damaged and unsaleable goods, to get rid of them. And that's what I had to look deep down within myself. All those calamities, those pompous things, and those worship of other beings. Get them out of my life. And what he said I'm going to do, he said, we're going to make out this list. He said there's 3 major manifestations of self. These resentments, fear, and sexual misconduct or harm to others. And he said, I want you to list all your resentments. And we made out this legal page. He put 4 columns on it. He said, I want you to list everybody you have a resentment towards. And he said, then next we're going to put down why you're angry at them. And next we're going to put down how it affected you. And then we're going to look at your part in it. And so I put down the people I was resentful at, you know, ex-wife, father, mother, few businesses, etc. And why I was angry at them, maybe 2 or 3 entries on each one of them. How it affected my self-esteem, how it affected my security, even affected my ambitions and my relationships, including sex. And I listed all those things down. And then there's another hook because the last column over there is on page 67. It said, where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, or frightened? In each one of those events that I had a resentment towards, I had to make a check sheet here and find out. And anything that happened there, was I dishonest? Was I selfish? Was I self-seeking and frightened? So I filled that out the best I could. And I moved on to my fears. It said I had to list all the fears. So I did. I started listing fears on a piece of paper. You wouldn't believe it. I mean, I put everything. Fears of snakes, little kids, you know, rejection, abandonment, I put down. I found it when I finished up, I had 66 fears. Well, if you go back to page 62, It says there in the first column, selfish and self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our trouble, driven by 100 forms of fear. Well, I was very selfish and self-centered, but I only had 66 fears. I didn't have 100 of them. And still, I was as bad as any of you are. So, got to my sexual misconduct, and I had to look down at everything that every single relationship and some of those things that I did, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to take a fifth step from the podium up here, but I listed almost every embarrassing possible situation that I had with the lady. But the thing that really got me was over here. It said, did we unjustifiably arouse bitterness? Gosh, I found in my personal relationship that I aroused a lot of bitterness. I left, and with relationships with women, I left a bitter taste in the mouth, Here I used to think, well, I did everything nice, but I really found out I didn't. After I finished everything, and Slick looked it over, and he said, fine, I want you to call Clarence, that was his sponsor, and go up and do your fifth step. And I said, okay. So I called him, went up and Clarence and started my fifth step. Before we started, Clarence said a prayer, asking God to be with us, to listen to what I had to say. And for about 3 hours, I told him everything I had on these sheets. And got to one place, he looked at me and he said, why are you angry at God? And I said, Clarence, I said, God doesn't like me. And he said, Diz, let me tell you something. You ain't big enough for God to dislike. Oh, cheap shots. Gee. So anyway, he talked to me. He said, you got the whole wrong idea about God. He said, you're sitting around here trying to barter with him, trying to tell him what to do and do this and everything else, and that's not the way you work in AA. He said, in AA, we got a real personable God. He doesn't go anywhere he's not asked. He said, if you'll just start asking in the morning to have his help guide you through the day, and at nighttime to thank him for doing that, you'll find out that your life will change. And I started doing that, and I've been doing it ever since. Step 6. I had to get my character defects and list them. And Clarence had given me a list of some character defects. I had another list of character defects. And Slick said, Diz, he said, the principles of the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous are the exact opposite of your character defects. And he gave me an example. He said, you turn your fear into faith. You turn your hate into love. You turn your anxiety and worry into serenity. Denial into acceptance, jealousy into trust. And a big one I like to talk about is loneliness into the fellowship. And I've never been alone in Alcoholics Anonymous. In 29 years, I've never been alone. When I did step 7, the thing that jumped out at me, it says, grant me strength as I go out from here to do your bidding. And I Slick, where am I going to get strength from? And he said, Diz, you've got the strength. You've looked at all your human problems in your step 1. You listed all your resentment, fear, sexual misconduct, and harm to others in step 4. He said you listed all your character defects and you discussed them with me, and that's where you get your strength from. And from here on out, you can do God's will. And I needed God's will in order to make my amends. I had most of that list, but Slick went up in the 12 and 12 in step 9 and showed me how I had to make a list, and it was the easiest thing to do is put 4 columns. The first column, the people you can get to now. Second column, the people you can get to next. The third column, people you can get to later. And the fourth column, those people you're never going to get to. And so he said, go fill it out. And so I filled it out. And I had somebody in each one of those columns. And I brought it back to Slick, and he looked at it, and he tore it up. And I started shaking my head and said, Slick, I don't understand what you're doing. He said, you haven't learned too much, have you? I said, well, yeah, I think I've learned a lot. He said, no, you haven't. He said, I notice on this list, you still list your ex-wife on there. And he said, Diz, you realize that every time you call her your ex-wife, that's very derogatory and it makes you look awful bad? I said, no. He said, why don't you find a better word for her and it might help you out? And so I call her my former wife. And he was absolutely right, because when I use former wife, people don't look at me like I'm a terrible individual anymore. Anyway, I made those amends just on that list going across. And after about 5 months, Slick heard I was going to go back to West Virginia. And he came over to the meeting one night and he said, hey, I hear you're going back to West Virginia. I said, yeah, I'm going back up for a visit. I got a granddaughter that's doing some things. He said, fine. He said, how about that former wife? You're going to be able to make that amend? I said, Slick, I don't know. I may not even see her. I may not run into her, you know. I said, I'm going up there for something special. He said, well, if you did run into her, you're going to make that amend? I said, yeah, I'll make that amend. And he said, okay. So I went up West Virginia, went to my granddaughter's party and walked in the kitchen. There she was. I said, oh, hell. So I went up and greeted her. She greeted me, and I said, can I talk to you a little while? And she said, yeah. We went outside, and I made my amends to her. I never said I was sorry. I just took responsibility for everything that happened between us. And I did a pretty good amend to her. And Slick told me one thing. If I was able to make that amend, he said, I want you to ask her if she has anything she wants to say. And so I did, and for the next 20 minutes, she blistered me like you'd never been blistered before. And that's not the rest of the story. Later on, when we were down in Tallahassee, she moved to Blackshear, Georgia, and she was living over there with my youngest son, and she was working around and everything. And went to a dentist one day, and the dentist found something in her gum, and they found out she had cancer. And she went through all the treatments at some of the hospitals up in Augusta and everything else, but, you know, the kids rallied around her and tried to perk her up and everything else. She eventually died. And I got a telephone call from my daughter. And she said, Dad, would you write Mom's obituary? Oh, boy. Slick was right. You know, I got to do something for my former wife that this fellowship has taught me. On page 8, in Bill's story, it says we're going to be catapulted in the fourth dimension of existence. What is that? Well, the next line says, I must know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. To me, that's steps 10, 11, and 12. So when you get up to step 10, you look at it, you know, first thing it tells you, we have entered the world of the Spirit. That's the fourth dimension of existence. The first one's physical, mental, and emotional. Now we're into spiritual living. It goes on through here, tells me I'm going to grow in understanding and effectiveness. And I think so too. I think I've grown in understanding this fellowship pretty good. And I think I can effectively make it work, not only for me, but for others. It tells me what I got to do. I continue to do steps 4 through 9 on an everyday basis. It tells me there's sanity will return. You remember back in step 2, sanity was kind of around a little bit, but now we get our sanity back. Over on page 85, it tells us we get our will back as long as we keep it in line with God's will. You know, step 11 suggests prayer and meditation, but what I really see here when I read it is 21 spiritual exercises I've got to do on a daily basis. When I get up in the morning, I've got to do certain things. When I go through the day, I've got to do certain things. At nighttime, again, I've got to do certain things. 21 of them are listed on these 2.5 pages. But there's another hook in there. That hook says, you go to God and ask for forgiveness. And when I talked to Slick about that, he said, Diz, unless you've forgiven everything and everybody that you have harmed, you can't go to God and ask for forgiveness. And so again, I had to go back through my whole life almost and see if I have forgiven everybody that I had harmed. And then I was able to go to God and ask for forgiveness. Step 12, having had a spiritual awakening, is to resolve these steps. We tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Well, Bill made it real easy for us to practice these principles in all affairs because the next 3 chapters were done with 2 wives, the family afterwards, and employers. So, you know, my marital life was pretty good. Nancy and I do a lot of things together in Alcoholics Anonymous. She's still working for a living, and I'm retired, and so I'm home. I'm there when she gets home. I'm not out running around. And that's because she's my wife. I love her. And that's what I want to do. The family afterwards, I'm the last of my generation. I'm the patriarch of my family. I not only have my own kids, but I have nieces and nephews. And I let them know I'm available if they need anything. I don't interfere in their life. But I let them know I'm available if they need anything at all. And a lot of times, they'll contact me and ask me some things to do, and I'll tell them. Sometimes they'll ask me about things in the past, and I'll tell them. To employers, well, I said I'm retired. I had to make amends to a couple employers, a couple bosses I worked for. And we have a pretty good relationship today. The other thing, try to carry this message to alcoholics. I went to a meeting one Thursday night. It was one of my favorite meetings. I went with my good friend Carl. He had 29 years when he died 3 years ago. And we would sit there together, and we'd always talk back and forth, and we did a lot of good things together. Well, during the meeting, I looked over close to the back door, and I saw this guy come in. And I'm telling you, he looked like he'd been in a cat fight. And he was standing next to a guy that I sponsored. And I said, I wonder what's going on over there. Well, after the meeting was over, this guy comes up, and he said, your name Diz? And I said, yeah. He said, I need a sponsor, and I want to know if you'll sponsor me. And I said to him the same thing I say to everybody. I said, are you willing to follow a few simple suggestions? And he said, yes. I said, well, let's sit down over here and let's talk a little bit. And he told me that he just got out of jail. He was in a fight with his girlfriend. Of course, he's married, and he's got a 10-year-old daughter. And he's just doing all those crazy things we hear alcoholics do. And, I mean, he had adhesive tapes on his glasses, keeping everything together, you know. He had a black eye. He had scratches all over him, you know. He just looked like he was, you know, really out of it. But anyway, we started working the steps, just like Slick did me. I took him through the big book just like Slick did me. He did a wonderful 4-step. First person down on his amends list was his wife. And I said, good. And I said, don't go romancer. You know, you go look her straight in the eye, and you make your amends. And he did. He did everything I asked him to do. As we went through 5 or 6 months later and everything, he'd call me up. Sometimes he'd just be out of whack. You know, the job was getting him down. All these things were doing wrong, everything else. And one time I said, John, do you know what the Scylla and the Charybdis is? He says, yeah. Usually nobody can answer that question. But he said, yeah, it was the story of Ulysses, how Ulysses was taking his ship and heading toward this destination, and he came up on this great big rock or this whirlpool. And Ulysses had to maneuver between that rock and that whirlpool, or either one would crush him or perish him. And he told me that story, and I said, John, that's exactly what we have to do in life. And I hung up the phone. About 6 months later, I was talking to he was doing real good. He's sponsoring people and doing everything. And one of his sponsors I had coffee with one day. And he said, you know, you wouldn't know it to look at John that he won the Pulitzer Prize, would you? Yeah. I had the good fortune to sponsor a man that won the Pulitzer Prize. He's still very active in Alcoholics Anonymous today. You see, the magic of this program can be found between the Serenity Prayer and the Lord's Prayer. But the miracle of the program is found between the Lord's Prayer and the Serenity Prayer. And that's what we got to do. I've never done this before, but I'm going to end with my favorite passage in the Big Book. It's not only a very good passage, but I like the way I read it. It's from the Keys to the Kingdom. It says, there is no more aloneness with that awful ache so deep in the heart of every alcoholic that nothing before could ever reach it. That ache is gone and never need return again. Now there is a sense of belonging, of being wanted and needed and loved. In return for a bottle and a hangover, I have been given the keys to the kingdom. I'm an alcoholic. My name's DIZ Titcher. Thank you.
I think we got a great talk going on here. Thanks for watching the channel. Taper Dave here. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, oop, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right, but I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.